My guest today is Professor Stephen Nagy. We'll be talking about Sino-Japanese relations. Dr. Stephen Nagy is Senior Associate Professor at the International Christian University in Tokyo, Japan. He holds a PhD in the International Relations from Waseda University, and he's a fellow at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute, a visiting fellow with the Japan Institute for International Affairs, a senior fellow at Macdonald Laurier Institute, and senior fellow also with the East Asia Security Center. He is working on middle power approaches to great power competition in the Indo-Pacific and on how Chinese scholars and Chinese policymakers understand Japanese and US foreign policy. Professor Nagy, thank you very much for joining us for this conversation.
Thank you for having me.
And I'm very curious about how you assess Sino-Japanese relations. Maybe we'll start with this. The relations seem very, very tense, seem that they have been very tense for many, many years. How you assess the relations now?
Well, I think a good starting point for us to look at where relations are today is to go back to 2010. And in 2010, we had a Chinese fisherman that rammed some Japanese Coast Guard vessels in the sea of the East China Sea. And this, I think, began the negative spiral of the current cycle of Sino-Japanese relations, in that the fisherman was arrested by the Okinawan government. This was an application of local law, which meant it reinforced Japan's claims on the Senkaku Islands. And of course, the Senkaku Islands is an area of dispute between that China has with Japan. And this, I think, from the Chinese standpoint, was a shift away from the status quo over the Senkaku Islands. Later, 2 years later, the Senkaku Islands were nationalized under the Democratic Party of Japan's Noda administration, and this was further seen by the Chinese side as a breach of the status quo.
Yes, I remember the I don't know how to call it, the tourist excursion by Chinese, Hong Kong, and Taiwanese activists on Senkaku Islands, which were, that was also a very important event.
Absolutely, but I think that those were controlled by both the Japanese side and the Chinese side, because I think they both understood the shared interest in ensuring that the Senkaku Island issue it remained quiet, it remained unpoliticized, and they kept those outside actors that could throw a wrench in the relations under control. But with the nationalization of these islands, what we saw is really the worst coming together of many problems. We saw a new nationalist leader come into Japan, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. We saw confident Xi Jinping come into power in the Chinese context. And this created what we call a negative spiral in bilateral relations, really until Prime Minister Abe was determined to normalize relations or bring them back to what we call seikei bunri, or the separation of economics and politics, which I think has been the traditional model of how Japan and China have dealt with their difficult past. To try to create a mutually beneficial relationship based on their comparative advantages in their economy and societies.
Yeah, well, exactly, despite the fact that I remember that Xi Jinping hasn't visited Japan for ages, and the relations personally between him and Abe Shinzo were also very, very lukewarm, to say the least. But economic relations were thriving. Japan had positive economic balance with China, exporting loads of goods and cooperating in many spheres. So somehow the economic and political realities were separated in a pretty healthy way.
Yes, and I think these two leaders also understood that their futures are intertwined, whether they like it or not. They have comparative advantages that relatively balance both states. Japan still has huge amounts of technology that it sends to China. It has a huge economic footprint in terms of a manufacturing base in China, and it hires millions of Chinese citizens, and it has very close relations with local governments in the Chinese context. So Abe and Xi came together in 2019 in Beijing, and they decided that they needed to move forward and normalize relations. And they came together to agree upon 55 shared infrastructure connectivity projects in third countries. There was also a commitment to normalizing the relationships, and importantly, a commitment for Xi Jinping to visit Japan in the spring of 2020 to sign a fifth political document, which would outline the next 10 years of the relationship. So these two strong leaders, these two nationalist leaders, were probably the right leaders to chart that path forward. But unfortunately, COVID-19 has not only affected their bilateral relations, but of course it's sent the world into a really difficult period. And I think the casualties, of course, is the bilateral relations between the two states, but also it's enhanced nationalism in both countries.
Yeah. Well, you talked about economy, politics, Senkaku Islands, but we didn't actually touch upon history.
Sure.
And this is a very important part in assessing and looking for reasons why the relations are so difficult. So let's talk a little bit about the Second World War and about how the Chinese and the Japanese perceive the way each other treat the topics connected with war today. Is the Chinese government satisfied with Japanese attitudes connected with admitting the moral responsibility for the Second World War?
Absolutely not. But I think you use the word attitudes, and that's really, really important. And I think our Chinese friends overemphasize the views in Japan that perhaps deny Japan's aggression in the region at large, or deny the Nanjing massacre or other events that the Japanese imperial government was very much responsible for. But when we look at views in Japan about the imperial period, we have a real continuum of views. We have, I guess, the left-leaning pacifist views that really are acknowledged very openly about Japan's aggression and how it invaded China and the terrible things that happened. And they foster international exchange programs. They bring in Chinese students. They openly discuss the Nanjing massacre. And I think this is one side of the spectrum. On the other side of the spectrum, we have right-wing conservatives that look at Japan's wartime behavior through the lens of imperial powers, that Japan was not really any different from the Brits or the Germans or other states. So this is the continuum that exists. But for the ordinary Japanese citizen, it's this quiet shame in many ways that this thing happened in the past and that they would like to get over it. That they, I think the ordinary citizen continues to recognize that Japan is a very changed country and that their country victimized other countries. But on the same hand, I think they see contemporary China, the People's Republic of China, as always shifting the bar, as proactively engaged in historical amnesia about its own history, whether it's the Tiananmen Square massacre, what's happening in Xinjiang with the Uyghur people, what's happening in Hong Kong.
Tibet, if we look at 1950s.
Tibet, but also we see historical amnesia about the apologies that Japanese leaders have made. And even the Japanese emperor has made apologies. So it's very complex. It's politicized. And books like Rana Mitter's China's Great War really is a great read to try and get a good understanding how China is very proactive in rewriting the post-World War II history, placing China front and center of the countries that defeated fascism. And I think that we, as scholars, discussing Sino-Japanese relations should understand that this historical issue is now a politicized issue.
Oh, yes, very much so.
And it is very, very difficult to unravel in the current circumstances.
Yeah, here, if I may continue with two more questions on this. So first is, I think I've heard a lot in the Chinese discourse that the Japanese society, through education, doesn't really learn a lot about the history of the Second World War. You mentioned this sort of feeling of quiet guilt in the Japanese society. Is it common? Are the ordinary Japanese, however we define them, are they aware of the history of the Second World War and the Japanese role in atrocities in Asia? So
yes, but I think that we should put Japan's imperialism in the context of Japan's historical experience over the past 150 years and what it means for Japanese identity. And in the same moment, we need to understand what Japan's imperialism means in terms of contemporary Chinese identity. For Japan, its modern identity stretches from about the 1860s to today. The big events from the Japan's perspective really was modernization, westernization, being defeated by the United States, the atomic experiences, the economic bubble, and the bubble burst. These are really the identifying characteristics of how Japan understands its modern identity and history. Its identity is not being built on China, but rather its experience in World War II and being the victims of the first and second atomic bombs. Well, the Chinese experience, and Mao Zedong said this in his meetings with Tanaka Kakue, one of the prime ministers that visited China to normalize relations in the 1970s, he said, you don't need to apologize. Without you, we wouldn't be a modern China. And what he was referring to is that Japan has played a central role in the defining of what modern China is, who they defeated to become a cohesive country. They brought the current Communist Party of China into power, and really it plays a much more central position in contemporary Chinese history than in the Japanese context. And thinking about it from this point of view, it's quite interesting to think, this is why we have such a different view about what the role of history in bilateral relations, but also national identity. And this continues to be a challenge for both states because, and we could jump to Korea. Korea has a very similar view about its contemporary identity compared to China, that without the Japanese annexation of the Korean peninsula, without the Japanese imperial government quashing Korean identity, there would be no modern Korea.
And no Hangul, yeah? The writing system was, I think, owes its popularity much to the atrocities from the Japanese hands. You mentioned about the whole spectrum of views on Japanese historical role from the left wing to the right wing. Don't you find that maybe the problem is that the government, the politics are very right-wing. So even though we have a lot of left-wing historians in Japan, people who honestly do research, speak, and the comfort women issue came because of the Japanese research, etc. But then if we talk about the political discourse, it's all in denial, all very much right-wing, very much conservative.
So I would not... I would say the discourse about World War II and the Sino-Japanese War would not be right wing in the extreme sense, but I would put it in the sense that the Japanese government today believes that the past is the past. They've had committees. 2015, they had a cabinet decision on what was the correct understanding of history, where again the former conservative prime minister talked about Japan's poor decisions. That's a one way to say that they made the wrong decision about how to respond to the West and how to engage with China. They've released extended reports, and there's been multiple apologies, not only from left-leaning politicians, but also right-leaning politicians. So I think that to characterize the current position and the education system as being led by far right is not really representative of the reality. But that said, I think they could be much more explicit about Japan's wartime behavior. I think that there could be much better education. But I'm speaking as a Canadian, right? In Canada, we debated the right and wrong about the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We debated about putting Aboriginal children in school.
A hot topic in Canada.
It is. But my point is how we think about education. And if you go to China and you go to Korea and you go to Japan, that kind of critical engagement of history is not the way we learn about history. And I think this is actually probably one of the challenges that these states need to engage in, how they understand their own history. And I don't want to be parochial in how I think education should be taught, but I think debating and teaching students how to learn the different sides of history is a really critical first step to finding ways to reconcile between these three states.
Yeah, that would be definitely useful if in education there will be more of that in East Asia, definitely in all three of the states. Let's leave history because we already talked a lot about this, and let's think about the present and the future. How Japan is viewing engagement with China in the areas of trade or the environment, which becomes preponderantly one of the most important topics now.
So I think what we commonly hear in the Japanese context, and this is even within right-leaning political circles, is that China is our neighbor. We cannot change our neighbor. We have to develop a functional relationship with our neighbor, and we should find ways to benefit from China's reemergence as the center economic organizing principle within the region. And with that, we see Japan really taking a non-zero-sum approach to China. So let me give you some examples. Japan has signed the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership with China. So this is an important agreement, which is basically ASEAN plus 6 minus India. And it has also signed the Comprehensive Trans-Pacific Partnership. One includes China and one excludes China. And I think that the excluding agreement, the TPP-11, may potentially include China and Taiwan in the future if concrete reforms and commitments were made in the Chinese context. So this is reflective of the zero-sum agreement. But we also see continued negotiations and discussions about a trilateral FTA between Japan, South Korea, and China, which again is evidence of a non-zero-sum approach. And we see Japan pre-pandemic, and arguably post-pandemic, this will come back, is on cooperation on climate change, cooperation on third country infrastructure, through the, not officially under the BRI or the Free and Open Indo-Pacific vision, but using these frameworks to find opportunities to cooperate. And I think non-traditional security issues will be also really important. Here I'm thinking about climate change, I'm thinking about illegal fishing, thinking about piracy, and of course, in our current era, transnational diseases. What could be more of an important area of cooperation than dealing with the next COVID-19, because there will be a next COVID-19. So they are definitely thinking about engaging with China.
Do the Japanese play the proactive side? Do they reach out to China, or is it rather waiting for maybe Chinese activity? Is Japan more active in trying to find areas for cooperation?
So this is a great question, and I think that it's led at different areas. Japan is a democratic society, so the Japanese Business Federation, the Keidanren, reaches out outside the government, and that is a possibility. But we also have party-to-party ways to engage. So the Liberal Democratic Party and the Chinese Communist Party reach out to find areas of cooperation.
Oh, I didn't know this. So actually, the party itself talks to the
other party.
Oh, that's interesting.
This is it goes. We have to go back to history, but party-to-party relations have traditionally been the area where Japan and China solve many of their difficult issues. Prior to 2010, the party-party relations were quite thick. So you could, somebody from the Japanese side could call up somebody in the party on the Chinese side, and they'd find ways to deal through backdoor diplomacy with some of the difficult issues. Now, this has become really, really more difficult, and explains why I think there's a divergence in bilateral relations, is that the people with direct experience with World War II have all passed. And the people with those strong relationships in each party are no longer influential in the same way that they used to be. And this is creating huge challenges. So prior to the Tiananmen Square massacre, of course, Hu Yaobang, which was a very connected politician in the Chinese Communist Party, but also had very strong ties with the former Prime Minister of Japan, Prime Minister Nakasone. And they used their party-to-party network to deal with many of the prickly issues that exist between these two states. Today, they're not as close party-to-party, and this, I think, is partly explaining some of the challenges that they're facing.
Right. You talked about reaching out and cooperation, but then there is one area where Japan definitely shows how different it is from China. That's the area of security, where Japan is very closely cooperating with the US. And the more the US is pressing China, the more Japan is maybe closer to the US and working, hand in hand. How does this influence Chinese-Japanese relations?
So geography and proximity are the key words that I would use. Again, it goes back to my point. Japan's a next door neighbor of China. So what happens in the region will immediately affect Japan much differently than the United States. And as a result, Japan takes an approach where it strengthens its alliance with the United States because it views that as the final guarantor of its security. But the domestic divisions in the United States have made that security guarantee more questionable in some ways, especially with the election of the former president of the United States. And what we've seen over the past 10 years or 15 years is Japan start to diversify its partnerships within the region. So we call them strategic partnerships, and the strategic partnerships are not military alliances. They're economic development, infrastructure connectivity, development where they provide aid to countries in Southeast Asia, for example, to help build their security capabilities to deal with the challenges in the South China Sea. Recently, they've signed the so-called reciprocal access agreements with Australia and the UK. And these are meant to help build some of the deterrence capabilities that Japan would like to invest in to push back against how the Japanese understand China pushing into its territorial waters and territories, but also thinking about areas like Taiwan. We should get into Taiwan, but from the Japanese point of view, Taiwan is indivisible in terms of security. It's a critical nexus for sea lines of communication, but also as a trade partner, and most importantly is those semiconductor supply chains that really go into many of the signature products of Japan, Toyota cars, Suzuki cars, phones, etc. So Japan is building deterrence capabilities to constrain Chinese behavior. But I think it's really, really important to understand that Japan's approach is not primarily through military tools, but embedding itself in the broader Indo-Pacific economy, institution building, helping countries develop, and really shaping the region's development so that it's transparent, rules-based. And rules don't mean that they're concrete, but rules that are based, that evolve through negotiation and compromise, and that they continue to be transparent. And this continues to be Japan's vision, and it's articulated through this idea of a free and open Indo-Pacific vision.
Okay, and how do you think, if we change the perspective and we look at China, how do you think China views its coexistence with Japan on both the rhetoric side and the pragmatic side?
Well, I'm just finishing a book on this, and it's really looking at how China's perspectives, scholars' perspectives and policy perspectives. We're looking at Chinese or Japanese foreign policy under Prime Minister Abe. So I did quite a few interviews in China before the pandemic, in Beijing, Shanghai, Nanjing, and Guangzhou. And what was interesting about this is that there's, at least 5 schools of thought about how Chinese scholars are thinking about Japan, and that they see Japan either as, a secondary partner to the United States, or as a state that's really interested in more autonomy and charting out a vision that is more linking Japan's security to the broader security, and that China is actually not the target, but rather the foil to, to restore Japan's position within the region, not as the dominant country, but as an influential country.
Well, this is what I wanted to ask you. Are there concerns among Chinese theoreticians and researchers about Japan being too powerful in the region?
Yes, but I think the hawkish scholars and the scholars that aren't Japanologists, those that haven't spent a lot of time looking at Japan, I think that the general understanding is shallow, and they overplay the strengths and underplay the weaknesses of Japanese society. But if you look at the Japanologists, they'll look at Japan's demographic challenges, they'll look at the general inclination towards pacifism, the declining interest in being a hungry, ambitious power, and they don't really see it as a reality. So I really don't like the idea of painting the Chinese worldview with one brush. I think there's actually a lot of diversity, but you need to drill down into, who are the ones speaking to the government. And the ones speaking to the government, I think, are generally much more pessimistic and overplay the position of Japan. And you need to talk to other Chinese scholars that have a deep understanding of its history, its relationships with countries within the region, and of course, its identity. So it's always useful to speak to many people and move away from dominant government position and try to get a better sense of which positions are not so representative at the government level, but are discussed in intellectual communities. And in that capacity, you'll see a lot more diversity.
And these are linked also to the think tanks of the Chinese Communist Party, and there is, I'm sure, a lot of flow of ideas, different ideas that reach to decision makers in China.
Well, there's incentive in the Chinese context to write about the triangular relations between Japan and the United States and China from the viewpoint that I think reinforces the party doctrine. And this creates challenges in terms of what is the appropriate understanding of other countries within the region. And again, this is a systemic challenge within the Chinese context. Are they getting the right information, and how does this affect policy formation? But at any rate, Japan is the second largest or third largest economy. It spends about $55 billion on its self-defense forces a year. It is a significant technological industrial power. And importantly, and I think indexes like the Asia Lowy Institute's Asia Power Index is a really great tool to see how Japan, really hits above its belt in terms of diplomatic power, in terms of development, in terms of trust within the region. So there's a lot of ways to measure, but I do think we need to disaggregate within the Chinese context the hawks and the scholars and the area specialists and how they're interpreting this relationship.
Right. Okay, one last question, and one area that we haven't covered that much are the structural realities that might make it difficult to pursue plans of closer cooperation between China and Japan. What are the challenges? What are the dangers?
Well, leadership is one. Leadership is always an issue. I think the current pandemic is also making, I'll break it down. So leadership, I think these black swan events like the pandemic, but I also think we need to look at the regional economy and how it's evolving in different directions. So let's start at the leadership level. I think within the Chinese context, President Xi will likely consolidate his power at the upcoming 20th Party Congress and the following spring National People's Congress. Likely, but this is not for certain.
Yeah, there are so many rapid changes that we never know, do we?
So I really think that this is one particular area. And if he consolidates his power, there's two choices. Does he want to recalibrate China's position after he's consolidated his position to tilt towards the West and Japan so that they can concentrate on economic development and really pivot back to Deng Xiaoping's focus on social economic stability and development is the primary goal of the Chinese Communist Party. That is one choice. But of course, there's the other choice. And, Kevin Rudd in his recent essay on Project Syndicate wrote about Xi wanting to end or, complete Mao's legacy of reunifying Taiwan with China.
Yeah, sounds terrifying.
It's terrifying because, frankly, I think it will result in a regional war and potentially much worse. It will destroy the regional economy that has brought prosperity and stability to the entire region. And it could become kinetic in a nuclear way very quickly. So this is potentially two pathways if he consolidates his rule. And we need to drill down into the Central Committee, the Politburo, and the Standing Committee's composition following these two important meetings. If he comes out weaker, this suggests that there's a lot of discontent with the direction he's taken China over the past 10 years, and that the different stakeholders within the party and within the Chinese political sphere would like a different approach to the West. This is also a firm possibility. So out of those three scenarios, two potentially means that China could tilt again to the West. I'm not saying open up completely, but start to think about more productive and cooperative relationships on regional and global issues. One of those scenarios is deeply disturbing, and it's something that we need to be cautious, and we need to continue to send the strongest of signals to Xi Jinping and the Chinese leadership that this is not an acceptable outcome. Personally, I think Taiwan is a global public good, but we need to stand by the one China policy. But we continue to send the message to the leaders of Taipei and Beijing that the status quo is the best situation to ensure we have stability in the region, that we continue to have economic integration that does bring social economic development to the entire region. That seems to be the best option, but leadership is a big issue.
Is change of leadership possible in Japan? Will the Liberal Democratic Party ever lose power?
They lost power a couple times in the past 70 years.
Twice, I think, only.
So I think when we look at the Liberal Democratic Party, it is an umbrella party. We have conservative wings and liberal wings. If we were to think about the current party in the Canadian context, we would call it a liberal party. Liberal in terms of social government intervention or government intervention into the economy, support for families, the support for culture. We would not consider it a conservative nationalist party, which is fascinating because I think the narrative is very, very different. I think we'll likely see political stability in Japan for the coming years, and I think this is great for Sino-Japanese relations. Prime Minister Kishida is facing an election this summer in July. He's likely to strengthen his position within the Diet, and that means he can start to take a more nuanced approach with the Chinese in terms of stabilizing relations post-pandemic and post-pandemic and post the two meetings in China. Nothing will change until those two meetings are finished in the Chinese context, and that will really help gauge the direction we're going to go. I mentioned leadership and I mentioned COVID-19. This pandemic came as a shock. It has enhanced many of the divisions that existed. We've seen some politicians racialize the COVID-19 pandemic, which I think has created huge problems. This is not a Chinese disease. This is a human disease. And this has really created challenges. Will another pandemic come or a large natural disaster, and how can this disrupt relations is an important thing to be thinking about. Lastly, I think is the direction of economic integration. And here I think that the Chinese are moving towards the dual circulation model, which is pulling away from the international market so that they feel more secure. And the West and their partners, such as Japan, South Korea, India, are starting to selectively diversify away from China, not decouple, selectively diversify on sensitive technologies. So if this continues to happen, what we might see is the balkanization or the bifurcation of the global economy into a Chinese sphere and a non-Chinese sphere. Now, this has many problems for prices, for mutual understanding, for how we engage with each other. And I think this is a really big risk. So we need to watch this carefully. There was one other point that I wanted to mention on this particular point is that, trade has been the primary vehicle of building understanding and creating non-government actors that keep our societies binded. And whether we look at the AmCham, the American Chamber of Commerce, or the Japanese Chambers of Commerce, European Chambers of Commerce, they've all been advocates for continuing to trade with China.
Yes, even though Donald Trump advocated decoupling, American investments increased in China. So
they were very explicit. They disagreed with Mr. Trump. But on the same hand, they want the Chinese government to change some of their practices. They want an equal trading field. They want to ensure that some of the Chinese local laws at least are more transparent. For example, data localization and what does the National Intelligence Law of 2017 mean in the Chinese context, or the 2018 cybersecurity law. There's a lot of implications for these laws on foreign businesses, and I think they would like some clarity so that they can maintain those relationships. So, the direction of China-Japan relations and China, let's say, West relations really are dependent at least on those three levels. And I think we need to watch really, really carefully, and we need to find crosswalks to de-escalate relations, create opportunities for cooperation through education and business, but also be conscious of the realities of what does Xi Jinping want for China, and what cost will that come for other countries. And the current direction, from my standpoint, is not as optimistic as I would like it to be. And I think it's a deviation from Deng Xiaoping's 24-character guideline for the direction of China. And I think those worries are broadly shared in the region. And look at the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies annual report from Southeast Asia. 2017, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, countries are worried about Chinese hegemony within the region. Countries are worried about China dominating the South China Sea. There's serious trust issues. So I think we really need to have a reality check that the how we think about China shouldn't just be through the lens of Japan-China or U.S.-China, but rather all of its regional neighbors and those other countries, because there seems to be a lot of commonality of concern, and that needs to be addressed on the Chinese side, but equally so, the Chinese side has many concerns of their own in terms of U.S. military presence within the region and the use of their market to shape China. Lastly, and I think importantly, thinking about Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, what is the messages that this is sending to China and to the regional countries? And I think from the Chinese standpoint, I think they've understood clearly that the United States and the EU and other countries really have hegemonic power over the financial system. And this is something that they will need to address if they really would like to take Taiwan by force, which I don't think they do. That if they would like to manage the current international order or tweak it in the way that we were talking today in your presentation, which I agree with, that they're going to have to take a much more cautious approach to how they engage with Taiwan. And there's also the lesson of how to take Taiwan by force. And this will require overwhelming power. Power to defeat not only the United States, but Japan, Taiwan, and its allies.
It will entail destruction.
Right. And
which is nobody's interest.
Nobody's interests. From the regional country standpoint, they're watching what the Ukrainians are doing with limited resources, and they're building their deterrence capabilities and selectively diversifying from China. So, it's interesting to think that, this Japan-China relationship that we started a discussion with now is linked to the fate of Ukraine in this part of the world, and that states in the region that I live in are looking at security very differently. They're looking at China very differently, and China's looking at the region in a way that it is being pushed towards securitization rather than building platforms for cooperation that I think are based on transparency and a common set of rules.
Okay, well, a lot of concerns for the future, but also some positive views. And I think we covered a lot from history to modernity. And I really hope that the positive scenarios will be the ones that will be actually happening. Thank you very much for our conversation, for all the insights, all the information. I think that was very, very valuable, very useful. And I do hope we have lots of good, positive things to talk about in the future.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much,
real pleasure.
Stephen.
Cheers.
Thank you. My guest was Professor Stephen Naji from the International Christian University, Tokyo, Japan.